He never opened the Quran out of curiosity or respect. He opened it with one purpose: to prove it wrong. A passionate Christian with years of dedication to his beliefs, he had long viewed Islam as a man-made religion, a set of confusing rituals, and a book filled with contradictions. He didn't hate Muslims, but he believed they were misled. He had spent countless hours watching debates, reading critiques of Islam, and building arguments that, in his mind, exposed the flaws of the faith. When someone suggested he read the Quran for himself, he didn't hesitate, not because he wanted to understand it, but because he wanted to defeat it. He thought he would read it, find contradictions, highlight inconsistencies, and come out feeling more confident than ever in what he already believed. But what he didn't realize was that his plan to challenge the Quran would end with the Quran challenging him. The moment he opened the first few pages, something unexpected began to happen. He was searching for errors, but he found clarity. He was expecting confusion, but instead, he discovered profound simplicity. It didn't feel like reading a historical text or a religious scripture. It felt personal, almost like someone was speaking directly to him. As he read through verses that spoke of creation, human purpose, mercy, and accountability, he found himself pausing, not because he was trying to refute, but because something was touching his heart. His thoughts became quieter, and a strange calm began to settle over him. The book wasn't aggressive. It wasn't trying to win an argument. It was simply presenting a message with power and gentleness, and it was landing deeper than anything he had ever read before. Days passed, and he kept reading, sometimes with interest, other times with hesitation. But every time he tried to walk away from the book, something inside pulled him back. He didn't want to admit it, but he was changing. His questions were not being dismissed. They were being answered, not through complicated theology or debates, but through words that spoke directly to his soul. He began to feel something he had never felt before while studying any scripture: peace. A peace that didn't need him to fully understand everything. A peace that came from the feeling that he was finally facing the truth he had spent his whole life avoiding. One night, while reading alone in silence, he came across a passage that broke him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't something he had never heard before. But at that moment, the words felt like they were meant just for him. He closed the book, held it to his chest, and began to cry. Years of arrogance, bias, and resistance came crashing down. He wasn't defeated in an intellectual battle. He was softened in a spiritual encounter. He sat there for a long time, heart pounding, eyes wet, mind racing. And then, in the quietest moment of his life, he whispered the words of the Shahada, not because someone convinced him, not because he wanted to impress anyone, but because he knew deep in his core that he had found the truth. This was not a conversion out of pressure. It was not a decision made in haste. It was the result of an honest, personal journey that began with pride and ended in surrender. He had opened the Quran to refute it, but instead, it opened his heart. He began his journey into the Quran with a firm mindset. His goal was not to understand but to expose. Years of religious pride had convinced him that Islam could never hold any truth, and that its teachings were the product of historical confusion and man-made traditions. So when he sat down with the Quran in hand, he carried the weight of his ego, ready to pick it apart. He expected to find chaos, contradictions, and philosophical weakness. He believed he would read a few pages, feel justified in his doubts, and walk away more confident in his own beliefs. But something happened in those first moments that he could neither predict nor control. As he read the opening verses, there was a stillness that began to settle around him. The words did not feel random. The message did not feel borrowed. Instead, he felt a strange sense of coherence, a flow that seemed far too precise to be accidental. He tried to push past that initial impression. He reminded himself of the purpose. He was here to dissect, not to be impressed. Yet as he moved through chapter after chapter, the tone of the Quran kept disarming him. It didn't feel like a human voice. It didn't beg for belief, nor did it scream for validation. It simply spoke, in a calm and powerful rhythm, addressing his mind and his heart at once. He noticed that unlike other texts he had read, the Quran didn't avoid difficult questions. It didn't shy away from pain, doubt, or death. It addressed life head-on, with both seriousness and mercy. It spoke of the human soul as if it knew it intimately, and that disturbed him, not because it was wrong, but because it felt uncomfortably right. Each night he found himself coming back to it, even though he never planned to. A silent force kept drawing him into its pages. He started highlighting verses, not to debate them, but to remember them. The tone in his heart was slowly shifting from confrontation to reflection. He began to ask himself questions he had never considered before. What if this wasn't just another book? What if the message he was resisting was the very message he needed? He hadn't come to listen, but the Quran had started speaking in a way he could no longer ignore. And that was just the beginning. As he continued reading, he found himself unsettled in a way that felt unfamiliar. He had spent his life absorbing ideas and constructing arguments, building a mental wall between himself and anything Islamic. But now, that wall was beginning to crack, not through pressure or persuasion, but through something he couldn't quite explain. The Quran wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, it wasn't filled with abstract philosophies or vague metaphors. It was direct, raw, and somehow deeply personal. Every page seemed to be aware of the one reading it. He didn't expect a scripture to address his private fears and inner struggles. He didn't expect to find verses that spoke about arrogance, about self-deception, about the way humans hide from truth, even when it stares them in the face. But that's exactly what was happening. He would read a passage, pause, look around, and wonder, how does this book know what I'm thinking? His assumptions were being quietly dismantled. He had expected the Quran to be filled with harshness, but instead he was finding balance. Mercy and justice were intertwined in ways that made sense to his soul. When he read verses about previous nations, about prophets, and about sincere seekers who rejected the truth because of pride, he couldn't help but see himself reflected in them. It was never just historical storytelling. It was layered with meaning, like it was inviting him to look deeper. And despite his resistance, he started doing just that. What surprised him most was that the Quran didn't demand blind belief. Instead, it asked him to think, to reflect, to consider. It kept asking questions he didn't have answers for. Not because they were complicated, but because they were too honest. He started realizing that much of what he had believed about Islam was never from the source itself. It was filtered through others, critics, commentators, culture. But the Quran had its own voice, and that voice wasn't trying to win an argument. It was simply stating the truth and letting the listener decide. For someone who had always defined himself by his ability to debate and out-argue others, this was humbling. The Quran didn't try to overpower him intellectually. It spoke in a way that made his heart soften. He had come with the intention to read and reject, but now, he found himself reading and reflecting, and with every verse, the distance between him and the truth was getting smaller. He thought he had full control over his emotions, especially when it came to matters of belief. But something about the Quran began to reach him in places no other book ever had. He had read religious texts before, many of them. He had studied arguments, debated ideas, and dismissed doctrines. But this time was different. As he sat alone, reading quietly, he felt something slowly unfolding within him. It was as if the Quran wasn't just informing him, it was transforming him. He had expected resistance. He had prepared himself to feel frustrated, to find contradictions that would strengthen his bias. But instead, he felt a quiet sense of being seen, known, and understood by the very words he had planned to criticize. The emotional turning point came one evening when he read a verse that stopped him completely. It wasn't dramatic in content, but in that moment, it felt as if it had been written just for him. He stared at it for minutes, the words echoing in his heart louder than anything he had heard all day. He tried to read further, but his hands began to tremble. Without knowing why, Tears started filling his eyes. It wasn't sorrow or guilt. It was a deep, overwhelming sense of realization. Realization that for the first time in his life, he was encountering something pure, something not molded by human ego or societal pressure. He wasn't crying out of sadness. He was crying out of recognition. His soul was finally touching something it had been searching for all along. He had always believed that faith was something inherited, something that belonged to others. But now, it felt like faith was knocking at his own door. And it wasn't coming with threats or force. It was coming with light. The Quran wasn't shouting at him. It was speaking softly to his inner self, the part he had buried under years of pride and arguments. In that stillness, in that room with no one else around, he felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with awe. For the first time in his life, he questioned everything, not because he was confused, but because he was finally clear. And in that clarity, he understood this book was not here to be refuted. It was here to be received. As the days passed, his quiet reading sessions turned into moments of deep introspection. What began as a mission to expose flaws in the Quran had evolved into a personal spiritual awakening. He found himself drawn not just to the content of the verses, but to the presence they carried. There was something in the way the Quran spoke that didn't feel ancient or distant. It felt alive. It didn't feel like he was reading history or law. It felt like he was being gently reminded of something he already knew, but had long forgotten. Every time he opened its pages, he experienced a strange calm, like entering a space untouched by the noise of the world. The tone, the rhythm, the message, it all worked together to peel back layers of doubt and replace them with something quiet but powerful conviction. He noticed that his worldview was beginning to shift. The Quran didn't just present facts or moral teachings, it offered a lens through which to see life, death, and everything in between. It didn't avoid suffering or hardship, it addressed it with purpose. It didn't sugarcoat the reality of accountability, yet it offered mercy so vast, it felt like hope was never out of reach. He found verses about patience, about trusting the unseen, about the nearness of the Creator. These weren't just ideas. They felt like answers to questions he had carried deep within for years. And the more he read, the more he realized that this was not the religion he had been warned about. It was not the stereotype he had accepted. Islam, as revealed in the Quran, was something entirely different. It was dignified, clear, and profoundly meaningful. What shook him most was how personal the journey had become. No one was preaching to him. No one was debating with him. It was just him and the words. And the words were doing something no argument ever could. They were healing. They were calming. They were guiding. And every time he tried to return to his old mindset, something inside resisted. The Quran had reached a part of him that he didn't even know was waiting to be found. It was no longer about comparison or proof. It had become about connection. He was no longer reading to criticize. He was reading to understand. And in that silent understanding, something in him had already begun to change. He started noticing changes in himself that he hadn't anticipated. The arguments he once held so tightly began to feel small and distant. The pride that fueled his journey slowly gave way to humility. He had never expected to admire what he was reading, let alone be affected by it. But now, even when he wasn't reading the Quran, its words would echo in his thoughts. He found himself pondering the concept of sincerity, the temporary nature of life, the weight of one's choices, and the quiet but powerful invitation to return to the truth. The more he reflected, the more it became clear to him that this was not about religion as a label. It was about submission to something greater, something real. He had spent years shaping his identity around belief systems that gave him comfort. But now he was face to face with something that offered not just comfort, but clarity. There was one particular verse he kept coming back to, reading it over and over again. It wasn't just the meaning, it was the way it felt. As if the verse understood him, as if it knew exactly what he needed to hear at the exact moment he needed it. He didn't talk to anyone about what was happening inside. It was too personal, too raw. But deep down, he knew that a decision was approaching. Not one based on fear or pressure, but one born from truth. A truth that had now taken root in his heart. His past, his questions, his resistance, all of it had led him here. And despite everything he thought he knew, this journey was changing him from within. He began to think about what it would mean to accept this truth fully. He knew the cost. He knew how his family might react, how his friends might question him, how the world around him might not understand. But for the first time, those fears didn't matter. What mattered was that his heart had found what it was searching for. He couldn't keep pretending. He couldn't unread what he had read. He couldn't unknow what he now knew. Every verse had gently pulled him closer to a moment he never expected. A moment where belief was no longer a debate, it was a realization. And that realization was preparing him for the step he was finally ready to take. The moment finally came, quietly and without ceremony. He sat alone, the Quran resting in front of him, like a companion that had walked with him through every doubt, every question, and every moment of clarity. There were no flashing lights, no audience, no voices guiding him, just the steady, overwhelming presence of truth that had been growing inside him day by day. His heart felt calm, but deeply moved. The tears that came weren't from sadness, but from a sense of arrival. It was as if his soul had been lost at sea, drifting through waves of confusion, and now it had finally found its shore. The Shahada, the simple declaration, was no longer a phrase in another language. It was the most honest thing he had ever spoken. And when he said it, everything inside him shifted. He felt a weight lift from his chest, the same weight he didn't even know he had been carrying. The years of questioning, debating, and doubting now made sense, not because they were wrong, but because they had led him here. Islam hadn't forced him to change. It had simply shown him what was already within him, waiting to be acknowledged. The peace he felt in that moment was not emotional hype. It was something far deeper, a stillness, a grounding, a knowing. He had tried to fight the truth, to out-argue it, to resist it. But in the end, truth didn't need to fight. It just needed to be seen. As he looked back on his journey, he realized that every step, even the steps he took away from faith, had a purpose. He thought he had come to defeat a religion, but in reality, he had been guided to it. The questions he once thought were obstacles turned out to be signs. The Quran had not answered every question with direct facts. It had done something greater. It had opened his heart. And once that happened, belief was no longer an intellectual exercise. It became a lived reality. He now stood on a path he once mocked, embracing a faith he once rejected, with a heart that now knew what it meant to surrender. Not blindly, not emotionally, but completely and with clarity. What began as an attempt to disprove turned into a journey of self-discovery and transformation. He never imagined that the very book he once approached with criticism would become the doorway to peace, clarity, and truth. It wasn't just a change of belief, it was a deep awakening of the soul. The Quran didn't argue with him, it spoke to him. It didn't confront his pride, it gently invited his heart. And in that quiet space, where truth met sincerity, something incredible happened. He found what he was never truly looking for, but what his soul always needed. The search for flaws led him to the foundation. The effort to refute ended in reverence, and the journey that began in doubt ended in the light of faith. Thank you for watching this video. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect, even for a moment, then share it with someone else. Because sometimes, one honest story is all it takes to awaken another heart. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content that explores real journeys, real hearts, and real transformations. See you in the next video, inshallah.